Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Iowa Ideas. Thanks for joining us this morning for our session on LGBTQ rights. My name is Dan. I'm your room host this morning. Before we start, I'd like to say thank you again to our presenting sponsor, ITC, and to our track sponsor, Inclusive ICR. To watch a short message from them, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen in Whova, you can click on View Recording to watch their sponsorship message. Also a reminder, if you do have any questions or comments, you can drop those in the chat box in Whova. I'll send those over to our moderator, and our moderator today is Quinn Pettifer. Quinn, go ahead, take it away.
Great, thanks Dan. Good morning everybody. My name is Quinn Pettifer. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the manager of brand initiatives for the Gazette. I'm also co-chair for Inclusive ICR. It's been great to see Inclusive ICR be involved within Iowa Ideas, not only this year, but in years past. So I am proud and excited to jump into a discussion this morning about LGBTQ rights. As the description indicates, we're going to be talking about a response to not only recent legislative session introducing bills that compromise or seek to compromise protective rights, but a historical look at where we have been, and also looking at application and implications of even introducing some of these concepts when we are thinking about building inclusivity in our communities. As Dan mentioned, if you have comments, questions, we want this to be a robust discussion. We're very fortunate to have amazing panelists with a lot of great insight, but we also want to hear from you that are doing the work as well. So feel free to jump in, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Whatever we don't get to, we'll be sending to panelists after the session so that we can continue the conversation. Right now, because we have people that are from our community, as well as even outside of the state of Iowa itself, I want to give our panelists just a couple minutes to introduce themselves, as well as their role, their position when it comes to the protection of rights and protection of and their involvement in the LGBTQ community, as well as the organizations that they represent. So I'm going to go down my virtual screen here and start with Connie Ryan. Connie.
Morning. Thank you so much for having us on this wonderful opportunity to talk about these issues that matter. I'm Connie Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa. We are an organization in Iowa that is statewide. We've been in existence almost 25 years. And we actually started out of an LGBTQ issue in Des Moines. And so we have done that work for the last 24, almost 25 years, working in partnership with a lot of different organizations, including One Iowa. You'll hear from Keenan in a minute. But really for us, it's about the core of what we do is protecting religious freedom, but also making sure that religion is not misused to discriminate or misused to harm people or take away people's rights. So we do a lot of civil rights issues and a variety of things. We do education, and we work on a whole broad spectrum of issues, not just LGBTQ, but that's what I'll focus on for today. We also lobby at the State House, so just a broad spectrum of work.
Thanks, Connie. Also, with us, we have Keenan Crowe with One Iowa. Keenan?
Yeah, Keenan Crowe. I use they and them pronouns because I'm a non-binary Iowan. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at One Iowa and One Iowa Action, which is a statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization. So we work across the state to try to impact policy for LGBTQ Iowans in positive ways through a number of different avenues. It's not just lobbying and rallies and things like that, although it is that. That is a lot of what we do. But it's also educational work. It's doing trainings, which is actually how we got connected to the Gazette in the first place, right? So it's creating grassroots pushback to things that we view as issues. It's a whole bunch of things that kind of all feed into one another with the overall goal of protecting and advancing LGBTQ rights in Iowa.
Excellent. Thanks, Keenan. And last but not least, we have Stephanie Munsterman-Scriven with the Cedar Rapids Civil Rights Commission. Stephanie?
Yes, good morning. So glad to be here and thank you for this opportunity. My name is Stephanie. I am the Executive Director of the Cedar Rapids Civil Rights Commission, and my preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. Our role in our community is there's two prongs. One is we investigate complaints of discrimination within Cedar Rapids. We do the investigations, we do the mediations, we determine whether or not discrimination occurred. And folks can file a complaint with us. It's never a cost to people. That's always a question we get. The second piece, we try to be, we have a proactive and reactive. Reactive, of course, is investigation where discrimination already happened. So the proactive prong is our education and outreach. So we try to do as much as possible in our community and elsewhere around, what are people's rights? What are the responsibilities of housing providers, of employers? And so we provide that information to folks in our community and beyond.
Excellent. So we're hitting this topic a very unique point in time on many levels, where we are in the calendar year, where we are in an election year, where we are in 2020, which has taken a lot of twists and turns alone. So I'll start with a real easy question. How secure do you believe our LGBTQ rights are for Iowa?
Oh, yeah, that is a doozy, isn't it?
Just dive right in. It's Friday, right? Why not just...
Yeah. I think that depends on which right you're talking about, unfortunately, especially as we have Amy Coney Barrett moving through the confirmation process for the Supreme Court right now. I am deeply concerned about what's going to happen to LGBTQ rights in the future. There are opportunities, for instance, for the Supreme Court to poke holes in the rights that Iowans have enjoyed since 2007, to poke holes in their employment rights, their housing protections, their education, public accommodation, everything. Everything's on the line. If they decide that somebody's religious views somehow trump somebody else's civil rights, we're in trouble. I'm not gonna lie. There's not gonna be a whole lot of things we can do about that in that situation. So that's a problem. So there's one. Two, the federal government, right? The Trump administration has been working really hard to chip away at LGBTQ rights at every single turn. Anytime they've had a choice between either keeping or expanding protections for LGBTQ people, they've gone in the exact opposite direction. It's always been a choice to take things away. It's never been a choice to affirm or to give folks additional protections. And then at the state level, like we saw 14 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced just this year. Depending on what happens with the elections in 2020, we could see the same number or more next year. It really just depends. I mean, elections have consequences, right? We say that over and over and over again. So at kind of every level of government, yes, things are in serious jeopardy. And I don't want to say that to scare people or to, try to engage in over the top rhetoric or anything. I just, from my perspective, I think there are threats at kind of every stage. And this is not something that we can take for granted. This is not something we can say this is settled and we're all moving on. Unfortunately, we have to keep fighting.
Yeah, I would add to that, and I would agree with everything that Keenan talked about. And all of our organizations are nonpartisan organizations, but who is in power, who holds the offices, who has the majority in the legislative and executive branches, both at the state level and at the federal level, that matters. And we think of our country as moving in a trajectory where rights are being added. When we look at the courts, particularly the state court, Supreme Court, we have continually added rights. And we don't have a history of taking rights away. Once we've figured things out and people have the right in this situation, the right to marriage, the right to whatever that is, we have a trajectory of making sure that we add rights. But what we're seeing is this effort to pull back people's rights. And that's in the legislative process, which is obviously connected to the executive branch at the state and federal level. But also we're seeing some of that in the courts. Both the federal and the state court have moved conservative. And so it is greatly concerning. And so, as Keenan said, elections do matter. And there's great concern that rights will be taken away. Rights that we have achieved will be taken away. And even so, then you look at the rights that we want to continue to move toward. Well, those could be out of reach. And so it's gravely concerning.
I would agree with what Connie and Keenan are saying. I'd also like to raise, in regards to taking rights away, this last legislative session, there were some bills, not only in regards to LGBT, but there was one in regards to lawful source of income, in which they would roll back protections already in place in cities and municipalities. And if that were to happen, that would be a pretty frankly scary precedent. So Cedar Rapids has had sexual orientation protection since 1999 and gender identity protection since 2012. So that is a vote that we took within our city. If those precedents were to be made, those state levels would roll those back. And of course, that is concerning because we have local control of what we want our community to look like. And as Quinn said, taking those rights away reduces our inclusivity and welcoming. I would say one bright spot was the recent Supreme Court ruling in June that showed, sexual orientation and transgender status violates, if there's discrimination based upon that, it violates discrimination based upon sex. And so that was one bright spot of this year. Now, of course, as Keenan said, there are ways to, poke holes in that in future. And that's why voting is so essential. So again, I just say that's the one bright spot. However, the dissenting judges, Alito and Clarence Thomas, have said a couple concerning things in regards to how it takes away rights of religion. And so we have to keep an eye on all of this, as Keenan and Connie said, at all levels of our government.
We've had a chance to have a conversation before the session today, and we talked a little bit about the history and some of the bipartisan federal legislation that was established in the early 90s, and just comparatively how that's traveled over time and how it's been interpreted, and original intent versus where we are today in some of those instances. Connie, I don't want to start with you, but I will, because you were the one that identified that is a place to possibly start here to get a historic look at where we have seen some of these rollbacks. Can you start us off with that?
Certainly, and Keenan can jump in on this, and Stephanie if she likes. But so back in the early 90s, there was a case that was really about use of peyote by indigenous people. That's where it kind of all started. And the state where this took place took away that right of that to be used. And I won't get into the details of that, but that eventually led to a Supreme Court decision that upheld the state's decision to take away that right. And Congress didn't like that. Congress wanted to create a path where people could practice their their religion in the way that they saw fit, and that the government couldn't take away that right when it was just your own practice of your faith. And so they passed with bipartisan support, with the support of lots of organizations on both sides of the aisle. We weren't as divided then, but there was still division. But lots of progressive organizations and lots of conservative organizations, and they all agreed that people ought to be able to practice their own faith when it didn't infringe on anybody else's, and that that they ought to be able to do that without the government interfering in that. So the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was created, and that was just at the federal level. And that's often referred to as RFRA. It's just the initials. There was some other legislation that happened that tried to expand that. Those didn't pass. But what has happened over the years is that original intent that the government can't interfere in the practice of your religion, that has been misused in our opinion. And so it has been changed and shifted, and we've seen lots of legislation in different states across the country where it is really making a hierarchy of whose rights matter the most. And so if I'm a person, it goes to the cake question, right? That's the most often used example. So if I'm a baker and somebody who, a same-sex couple comes into my shop, do I have to serve them? It's a question around healthcare and reproductive rights. Does a company have to offer contraception as part of healthcare as an option? So those are some of the questions that come around to that. And so it changes it from a government to individual relationship to an individual relationship. So does my religious freedom trump your civil rights or your access to other protections in law? And then the government becomes the mediator of that. So it's the individual to individual, with the government being the mediator. And we've seen a number of pieces of legislation, as I said, across the country, where it gives preference to religious freedom. And that's what it has shifted to. Rather than the government can't take away your ability to practice, it is putting religious freedom above people's civil rights to accommodation, civil rights to employment, civil rights to a variety of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I often when RFRA gets discussed, and especially when RFRA gets discussed in Iowa, they like to trot out, oh, well, Senator Ted Kennedy supported this, Bill Clinton supported this, all these folks supported this. Yeah, that's true. I think folks have some misapprehension that we always get everything right. And that just could not be further from the truth. Sometimes we think something is a really good idea and we implement it, and the implementation goes completely off the rails. And that's exactly what has happened with the federal RFRA. So one of the ways, and I'll just very briefly touch on this mechanism, that it has gone off the rails was the original language was a restriction from government interfering when it substantially burdened somebody's religious exercise. Unfortunately, what the courts have interpreted substantial burden to mean is any burden at all. As long as it's uncomfortable or annoying or upsetting in some way, they're considering that a substantial burden. And so even when we've crafted these laws specifically to try to guide the courts in a certain direction, we can't control that process. The courts are going to do what the courts are going to do. And so whereas this started as a shield for minority religions to stop government from encroaching on them, from engaging in their rituals and practices on their own time, what it has become is a shield for dominant religions to kind of poke holes in the civil rights of others so that they can do literally whatever they want whenever they want to. And that's really been the problem with these kind of religious exemption laws, is not that it's not good to allow people to practice their religion however they would like to. It's that it's allowing folks to kind of weaponize their religion in some way and use it against other folks to discriminate against them.
And I would also say that we're not anti-religious freedom. We believe that people should be able to practice their religion. But we also believe that, as Keenan was saying, you don't get to use your religion, your religious practices, your religious freedom to infringe on the rights of other people. So there's often the saying of your religious freedom ends at my nose, so to speak. So you don't get to infringe and take away my rights because of your religion, your religious practice, your religious freedom.
And let's be real, like what happens in these situations can go wildly off the rails. We talk about cakes and things like that, and you hear the cake case all the time, but there are way more scary things that happen with RFRAs than cakes. There was a case out of Utah, for instance. There was a religious leader trying to use children to harvest pecans, and I don't know if you've ever seen a pecan harvester, but it is a giant piece of machinery. I mean, you're talking like backhoe level of heavy equipment, using children to run these multiple hours a day and flouting child labor laws. And they were able to use this RFRA to avoid testifying in court because they said their religious beliefs don't allow them to testify in court. There's no nexus around these. It doesn't say that you can't use these for criminal justice laws. It doesn't say that you can't use these for domestic violence situations. It doesn't say that you can't use these to try to turn unmarried women away from housing. I mean, the possibilities here are really endless, and they're very scary.
Stephanie, I think that's a good segue into some of the work at the commission with interpretations and application, and how there can be some confusion when it comes to defining discrimination. Statistically, our number of complaints are relatively low, and yet we know it exists. So in terms of your work, how do you help educate people to identify what's fair, what's equitable?
Yeah, as you said, there are cases, they're very low in regards to gender identity and sexual orientation, but we know discrimination occurs. A 2017 study showed in the workplace, 57% of folks in the LGBT had slurs, 53 had microaggressions, 51 had sexual harassment. And those are people who are willing to report it during a survey. So we know this is happening. So what we try to do is make the connections within the community. We have conversations like this, or remind folks gender identity and sexual orientation are protected classes within Iowa, as well as Cedar Rapids. And so if you feel you've been treated unfairly at work, in your housing, in credit, you go to get a bank loan and you feel you're being treated unfairly, in education, public accommodation, going to your doctor's office. A lot of folks in the LGBT community feel they're treated unfairly in healthcare. That is protected within Cedar Rapids and Iowa. So if folks feel they're being treated unfairly, they need to call us or email us, contact us, and we can look into that. We do try to make the connections. This year, as we all know, has been a little bit interesting. We try to go out to, all the events, see our pride, table and be out there. Typically we have many more events where people can come and learn about rights. So in the meantime, we're doing virtual events, virtual conversations around different rights and responsibilities. It's not only my right, it is the employer's responsibility to ensure that I'm not being treated unfairly based upon my sexual orientation or gender identity. And employers, fair housing providers, and other organizations need to be aware of those rights. So that is another piece that we really work hard to do in our community, is provide that training, provide the education. And, again, the one good thing about us being a government entity is we do not charge. All of our trainings in regards to that are free, because I know sometimes that's a barrier for some people. So we love to get into the communities. We love to get into the employers. We love to get into with landlords and real estate agents to talk about, what does discrimination look like? And it can be very basic. It's those slurs, continuous slurs. It's misgendering somebody. Like Keenan goes by they, them. And if I continuously if I say him, if I say he, constantly, even though he has said, hey, I go by they, them, please call me as such, and I continually, purposefully continue to misgender Keenan, that is possibly a discriminatory act. And so those are some pieces of what discrimination might look like.
As this session identified our past session and the bills that were presented that could have potentially compromised some of these rights. I want to talk, each of you have weigh in on this, please, but the various ways that bills have been brought in either what's been described as kind of little bits and pieces at a time versus one big wipeout or sledgehammer, I think is what was referenced in our conversation. How do you go about addressing the little pieces, the little pieces mythology versus the big? Are they one and the same in terms of your approaches when you see these come up?
Well, so I think I was the one that used the sledgehammer analogy, but so there are bills like a RFRA bill. So in Iowa, we've had RFRA legislation for a number of years, and Keenan and I work with some wonderful colleagues, and we do that work together to push back on the RFRA legislation. And the business community has been awesome in that, and Keenan can talk more about that piece of it. But back in 2011, we saw what I refer to as a RFRA light bill. And so it was RFRA type language, but it was specific to marriage because we had the Varnum decision in 2009, and the justices were kicked off, the three justices off the court in 2010. And so there was a legislation in 2011. And that has morphed over the years so that we have had multiple years of RFRA legislation that we have pushed back, thankfully. But we also saw a piece of legislation this last year that would take transgender out of the Civil Rights Law Act entirely. But then there's also these other pieces of legislation that are picking away at rights, like around marriage applications and different things. And so in a way, we lobby differently on those. And part of it is that the big things get lots more attention by different groups and often by the media. But that picking away at rights is equally as important to push back on that, because that can become much bigger, and it is insidious that of the system if you're taking away little bits and pieces, and not quite as obvious sometimes as those big pieces that would take it away all in one shot. So you have to do both parts of the work and be vigilant all the time about that. And that's a lot of the work that we do.
Yeah, as Connie said, it's pretty easy to illustrate if somebody is trying to take gender identity out of the Civil Rights Act, what's going to happen and what the intent is, right? The intent is to remove rights from an entire class of people. And folks aren't okay with that. Even folks that might be uncomfortable with LGBTQ people normally aren't okay with saying, well, let's take all their civil rights away. Like that's normally a little bit beyond the pale for folks. But if you go back even, just 2 years to the end of the session, the last 24 hours of the session, they wrote discrimination into the Civil Rights Act. They literally said, the state is allowed to deny medically necessary care to transgender people under Medicaid. That's what it says. There's really no other way to put that. But because it's a complex issue, because people don't even understand what medically necessary means at some level, and because it was done so rapidly, they were able to accomplish that kind of I would say abuse of the Civil Rights Act. I mean, the Civil Rights Act is in place to protect people from discrimination, right? So to write discriminatory language into that document is, I don't even have words for it. It's just appalling at some level, and you will see continual attempts to do that. So it's not just medical care; it's also looking at what they're teaching in schools. It's looking at who is allowed to participate in activities. It's all sorts of different things.
Yeah, I would also include, like you said, Keenan, it's not always apparent how it's going to affect the community. So we have, it's called disproportionality. So, one example is the rollback of regulations for schools around sexual harassment and sexual violence that Betsy DeVos rolled back the Obama era rules and changed the from preponderance of evidence to clear and convincing evidence in order to prove that you've been sexually harassed or sexual violence at school. That is incredibly hard to prove just in general, but then the impact to the LGBT community is at a higher disproportionality of impacts from that because they're more likely to be sexually harassed, more likely to be attacked, assaulted. And so we see not only does it impact, just women in general or men in general, it definitely impacts those in the LGBT community because of that. And so those are the things that we, like Connie said, we have to stay vigilant. Looking at that, you're like, okay, that's terrible, but what does that really mean? And it truly impacts, small slices of our community, and it increases the marginalization and oppression of those folks when we take away those protections. And so on the face of it, it looks like, yes, it looks awful, but when you dive into it even more deeply, you realize the impacts of it are much more egregious for different communities.
We talk about legal protections versus reality. I know, I think Keenan was that we had identified it as a tension point for moving forward. Some of the intentionality when it comes to the work of building an inclusive community, and however you define that, whether that's a place of employment, a community, a neighborhood, an environment where an individual can be their authentic self and not only feel welcome, but feel engaged. Where are some of those tension points right now where we're seeing intentionality versus reality?
Yeah, so in the legal community, you often hear this voiced as de jure versus de facto. So in other words, what's in the law versus what actually happens after you pass the law. And sometimes those are very different. Like we talked about it with RFRA, right? Like we had really good intentions with that, but the intentions didn't translate into the implementation. And so you will find that from time to time. There's also just situations that the law can't reach. It's impossible to, change somebody's mind with a law. You can't do that. That's not something that you can do. And so when you have situations like Stephanie has been mentioning, with folks that don't even know that they can claim those protections because other folks around them have not made them aware of them, because there's a culture of belief that maybe they deserve this, or maybe that this is acceptable, or maybe it's not acceptable, and maybe they don't deserve it, but maybe it's too much effort to file a complaint, or they think that they're not going to win, and so they don't want to be seen as a troublemaker. All those things kind of impact people's belief structure around how they can access the forms of redress that we've already created. And so you'll see statistics, for instance, about 50% of LGBTQ people in the United States aren't out to their employers. So half of LGBTQ people aren't out to their employers. Now, we know when folks are out to their employers that they're happier, they're healthier, they lasted their job longer, they have better job performance. I mean, there's all sorts of benefits that go along with that. So it's obviously not something that they're doing because it's fun, right? It's something that they're doing because they believe they have to in some way. They believe they're going to get passed over by the promotion that they want, and they don't know how they're going to be able to prove that in court. They believe that they're not going to get hired at this other job, but they can't really prove that it was because they're an LGBTQ person. And so there are these major gaps that we can't necessarily solve with legal redress. And in that case, what it really comes down to is changing hearts and minds. And so that's why education is a huge component of what we do at One Iowa, because until we change people's minds, some of those things are unfortunately not going to change. There's just not going to be any way around it.
I would agree with you, Keenan. The process to file a complaint with the Civil Rights Commission is burdensome. And because we ask you for documentation, we ask you to answer questions. We try to make it as unburdensome as possible, but we also know it, number one, it takes so much courage to file a complaint because retaliation is, talking about the law versus reality, it is a reality. While retaliation is illegal and there is redress for that, as well as the initial complaint, and we understand that when people file a complaint, they might be seen as a troublemaker, or they might lose hours, or they might be terminated. So yes, we understand that it's completely burdensome. And so we work really hard on our side to make it as smooth as possible, to explain the process, and our investigators, they work really, really hard to make sure that the folks who file a complaint understand every step of the process and have a right to talk and add evidence and conversation at every step of the process. And it goes back to, what Keenan was saying too about education and outreach. People just don't know. They have no idea that it's illegal to be treated unfairly based upon their sexual orientation or gender identity. As much as we try to be out in the community, it's hard to touch everybody. And so we work really hard to get the information out to people because it is your right to be protected and to not be treated unfairly. Now, some other pieces of reality in regards to making a welcoming environment, there's small things like I love how the four of us all have our pronouns behind our names in our Zoom call. That makes it, more socially acceptable for people to express that. I have it in my email signature line underneath my name and title, just so people have that freedom. When I introduce myself to different folks, I give my pronouns. So it sounds so small, but to respect that pronoun, to respect who you are as an individual is so powerful. And it's so important to create that community of belonging.
Yeah, and I would just add that it's not only about employers, it is about employers, but it's also as a service provider or as a storefront or whatever that might be. And so sometimes it's not just what is in the law and following the letter of the law, but it is also going above and beyond simply because that it is of value. It's the right thing to do, creating that environment, as Stephanie was saying, of welcome. And so what are the things, thinking about how you operate, whatever it is, as a business or a service provider or owner of apartments or whatever that is, how can you create that idea that not only welcome but also valued for who you are, and I think having those conversations with folks and learning and educating yourself and others is a key piece of that.
I think we also have to keep in mind, so I think John Gaventa breaks this down really well. And if you get a chance to read his book, Power and Powerlessness, I suggest you do, because power is something that we think of in a very specific way, but it is much more expansive than that. So traditionally, when we think of political power, we think of people that go and vote, that participate in the system, that are speaking up. That's kind of like the first level. That's like the narrowest conception of what it could be. There are also a whole lot of people who don't participate, right? There's levels outside of this, and they're not participating because we have set this kind of narrow parameter of these are the issues that are acceptable to discuss, right? The people in power have been able to frame this as this is what's acceptable to discuss and this is what's not acceptable to discuss. And then outside of that, even further, are all of our social beliefs and practices and things that convince us what is acceptable to discuss and what's acceptable to ask for redress and things like that too. And those are really, really hard to change. That last final level is really about what we believe is normal, and that normalcy kind of covers that power up. It makes it invisible. It makes it really hard to see and therefore really hard to tackle. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at is that third level there of what do we believe is normal, and is that the case? And if we changed that belief, what would things look like?
So for those that are attempting to get through to advance in those levels, especially within as an institution, as an organization, what happens? My question is, what happens when you see policy interrupt these efforts? And I'm going to make a very recent reference to the. Oh, thanks. Getting some feedback here. I'll keep going.
Feedback too.
The recent executive order that barring training that involves race and sex stereotyping or scapegoating for federal workers, contractors, and grant recipients, which has caused a pause on diversity and inclusion training for institutions within our region, within the University of Iowa. Do you feel encouraged? My question to our panelists, do you feel encouraged by the public pushback that this has received from some of our businesses and institutions? Just overall, I guess, thoughts.
Yeah, I feel encouraged by the pushback. It you scratch your head in these days where there's so much upheaval in terms of racial justice to create an executive order that says that we shouldn't have diversity training, inclusion training is beyond understanding. I mean, just the idea that we're not going to do that and questioning what the University of Iowa and their decision to move forward on that is also baffling. And so I am. It does bring hope when business entities and individuals say that's wrong and the executive order is wrong and living by it is wrong. But we have to get back to the idea that what Keenan was talking about, we have to tackle these broad ideas of what really forms our beliefs and be able to talk about that and to be able to educate ourselves on that. And when you take away tools at the university level or whatever the entity is, then you have to figure out a different path then, I guess, because it still has to happen. People still need to learn. People still need to be able to have discussions. People still need to be able to challenge discrimination when they see it, but they have to have the understanding and knowledge to be able to do that. So it is baffling to me.
Yeah, I will first give kudos and say thank you to Iowa State for coming out the other day and saying we are not pausing or getting rid of any of these trainings. That's not our job. I've seen the rest of the Big Ten Conference come out and say we're not pausing or getting rid of any of our trainings. The only institution that I have seen that says they're pausing or getting rid of any of their trainings is the University of Iowa. And let's be very clear about what's happened here. The university, an educational institution, has allowed themselves to be intimidated out of educating on certain topics. And I think that is just absurd. I just cannot understand how they've let themselves be manipulated in that way to say, well, oh, I guess we're just going to cover these other things because this one's too scary and maybe our money will go away. Well, what's more important, creating a learning community where everybody feels safe and accepted and understood, or some grant money for some research? I mean, that's really what we're looking at here, because this is also just tied to federal contractors. It's not like they're talking about, professors or custodial staff or anything else like that. The vast majority of their money is totally safe. So they're worried about losing this tiny pool of money. And in order to keep it, they're going to throw their marginalized students under the bus. I don't know how to put it any nicer than that, to be completely honest. I think it's very, very upsetting. You're muted, Stephanie.
Oh, Stephanie, you're muted. Oh, I'm sorry. Stan, our room host, I think can you please unmute Stephanie?
Uh-oh.
Okay, we'll put a
There we go.
quick chat here.
Thank you.
All right.
I was trying to unmute myself and it said host only. Absolutely.
This would be a good time to remind people, if you do have, so we do have the mute function on just because we have such a large number, which is fantastic, people in the session here. If you do have questions or comments that you'd like to raise, please put them in the Whova chat function and Dan will set them over. Sorry, Stephanie, please go ahead.
No worries. No, Connie and Keenan did a really good job of, talking about the implications of this executive order. And looking at the actual executive order, there's very explicit pieces. It doesn't just say no diversity training. It just, I can't say you're a bad person because of your race or you're a bad person because of your sex. However, it does have a dampening effect on what we can and can't do. The Civil Rights Commission, that's what we do. We do civil rights training and we do training in regards to this. And of course, there's the whole legal aspect. Are we a federal contractor? Because we do work with EEOC and HUD. While this doesn't come in effect until November, we're looking at our trainings. But the good thing is our trainings are fine as they are. We are talking about biases. We're talking about privilege. We're talking about disparities, and that goes across all spectrums, gender to sexual orientation to race to marital status. But again, I agree that it's been really heartening to see so many people who don't agree with this, who don't think that this is an okay thing, who also agree that systemic racism is a thing. It's not, as some folks have said, it's not racism to say that it occurs, that it is a thing. And so I have been heartened from folks reaching out to us, the Civil Rights Commission, saying, hey, we support you. We're excited that you're out in the community, that you're doing these trainings. But like I said, it does have a dampening effect for, as you saw, Iowa, they put everything on hold, and that is very concerning. But on the positive side, so many other organizations are still providing those trainings and still providing that information. So again, I agree with Keenan. It comes down to what are your priorities? Yes, money is important, otherwise you can't function. However, if you aren't doing the main mission of what your institution is created for, then you don't need your money. So it's kind of an interesting balance.
Absolutely. So as as we're approaching election, but we'll get there. But in preparation for a next session, how do you prepare? And I'll reference back to 2020 and just all of the curveballs, just in approach of prepping and lobbying advocacy in general has changed. How are you preparing for the next session? Are you preparing for the next session, or are you waiting until after November 3rd?
We have some loose plans, but it's more of a dual track kind of situation. Well, maybe it's actually a quad track, because there are 2 tracks based on the outcome of the election. And then there are 2 tracks based on kind of how coronavirus goes and what things are going to be implemented at the Capitol for in-person meetings and things like that. Like, are we going to have to go 100% digital? Is there going to be enough distancing where it's safe to be in the building for certain periods of time? We don't know. And so, combine and contrast all those different options together. And I think we kind of have some loose plans, but the more information we get, I think that the more that solidifies what angle we're going to take. There are some things that aren't going to change no matter what. We had a unanimous passage of a gay and trans panic defense ban out of the House this year. And it got derailed at the end of the session because of coronavirus. But there's obviously broad consensus on that across parties, right? So that is on our agenda regardless of what happens. And if I have to send carrier pigeons or something to get to legislators on that, I will. Hopefully Chuck Grassley doesn't intercept any of them if you've all been reading his tweets lately. But we will communicate in whatever way we can.
Sorry, I don't know how you follow up after carrier pigeons, but anyway, yeah, we're in the same boat. We definitely are looking at different paths. If you're in Iowa, you know that the legislature has been controlled by the Republican Party and our governor is Republican, so that the three legs have been controlled by one party since 2017. And so that has been difficult for the issues that Keenan and I work on at the State House. That's been difficult. A lot of what lobbying is and a lot of what changing law is about is our relationships. You have to have relationships with folks who make the decisions. And so that piece of the work doesn't change because we've already built those relationships. Do I talk with every legislator on every issue? Absolutely not. But you have to be able to talk with folks and help them to understand your perspective. Whether or not they agree is an entirely different thing, but help them understand your organization's perspective. So we will continue to do that. What that looks like in the nitty-gritty depends on the makeup of the legislature and whether or not one of the chambers changes after November 3rd. So that's when we get into the real details of the work that we want to accomplish. And truthfully, the work that we know that we may have to, a lot of lobbying is stopping legislation. I mean, probably, well, in these days, that's the dominant part of our work. 99%. So, right. And that's all lobbyists, that's all organizations. You spend a lot of time talking about the things that you don't want to happen. So we do a lot of that work, but it's always good to have the agenda of what you do want to move forward, because that is what gives you hope of what our laws and what our state can be.
So for those of us that are not in the space of advocacy in official capacity, but consider ourselves advocates, so whether that's as an individual or as an employer that's trying to build an inclusive culture, what can we be doing to drive this work forward, or to keep LGBTQ rights as a priority in our day-to-day?
I mean, if you're an employer, I would highly suggest seeking out some training to learn a little bit more about the LGBTQ community, obviously to learn about what the legal situation is and the protections that those folks already have, but also how you can go further than those legal protections. That's not a ceiling, right? That's a basic floor of what you should be doing for your employees. And there are a lot of other things that folks just haven't thought of. I like to say that our trainings in particular often raise a whole lot more questions than they answer, but they're questions that need to be asked, that employers need to be asking themselves. Do I have written guidance? If an employee transitions while they're working for my organization, what's going to happen? Who's going to communicate their name change to their clients? Who's going to communicate their name change to their coworkers? What's the restroom access situation? What are dress codes? How do they change their name in the payroll system? What's going to go on their security badge? There's all these different questions that if you've never had an employee transition in the workplace before, you don't know to ask those questions, right? But it behooves you to ask them far ahead of if you have a transitioning employee, so that you then don't have to have a company-wide meeting to discuss the transgender employee with the transgender employee present, because that's really the kind of worst case scenario situation there. In terms of an advocacy perspective, I suggest everybody to figure out who your local representative and who your local senator is, your state senator and your state rep, and set up a coffee with them. and start talking to them about your concerns before the legislature begins. If you've never done that, it might seem very intimidating, but that is literally their job, and they will take meetings with constituents. Like that is something that they often enjoy doing, and that is one of the job requirements, is to meet and chat with constituents. So it's their job, it's their obligation, and you should go do it. You should start talking with those folks now, so that when an issue comes up that you care about later, you've already established that relationship.
Yeah, advocacy really is all about relationships. I tell people, if you're going to ask something of somebody, regardless, outside of legislative advocacy, if you're going to ask somebody of something, you're going to get a far better result if you know that person already and you're asking of your friend or you're asking of your family, rather than a stranger on the street, right, that you've never met before. So Keenan is absolutely right. Get to know your lawmakers, and they are there to represent you and have a responsibility to do that. But you have a responsibility to get to know them and to take that step and to talk with them about the things that matter to you, and do that outside of the Capitol. Do that now. COVID is hard. We get that, but phones still work, and obviously Zoom still works, and it's just really important to build those relationships, because then when there is something that happens and you want them to know what you think about it, you've already built that relationship, so they have a bit of trust of who you are.
I agree with the two-prong, Keenan, with the training. The training is the baseline. You can always go above. You can't go below, but you can always go above. It's the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. I always, was taught growing up, which is the applicable one. It's the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law is to be inclusive and welcoming, so everybody feels like they can be engaged in our community. And talking to our lawmakers. Of course, we talk to our state reps, we talk to our local reps, but I also recommend you talk to your city council, you talk to your county supervisors, you talk to school board members, because those are folks who are also making some very impactful decisions in the local area. And so I know some cities have talked about, conversion therapy bans. And so we can't do it statewide at this moment. We haven't been able to do it statewide, but perhaps that can be something that can be started at your own municipality. So I highly recommend talking to your city council, your Linn County, or your county supervisors, your school board, anybody who is in office, anybody who has been voted, they have the obligation to talk to you as their constituents. Have those conversations, and just reiterate what they're saying. Do that now. Make those conversations now. Nobody wants to come into a conversation being told what to do. So it's good to have that relationship built before you start talking about, needs of the community.
I think that's been a common thread. And we did have a session yesterday about diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies overall. And, one of the big takeaways was just that initial assessment. And so whether you're an employer or an individual, taking that step back and assessing what are you doing to protect individual rights, and being able to have that proactive approach. I think that's really one of my big takeaways from this discussion this morning. But my last question to each of you, as I do in every Iowa Ideas session, is what can we be doing as Iowans to move this work forward? I know that we've already hit a lot of these points, but if there's a call to action, even if it's from your own organizations, this is the time to share. So I am going to go down the row on this one just so that we make sure we get everybody in here. And Connie, I'll start with you.
Use your voice. Be willing to use your voice. We've seen so much of that this summer, particularly around racial justice issues, and people, whether they're in the street or whether they're making calls or whether they're writing letters, whatever that is. But use your voice, and your voice matters. It truly matters, and it truly makes a difference.
Stephanie.
I would think, first of all, learning what your rights are, learning what your responsibilities are. So learn that for yourself. And then, as Connie said, share that with other people so everybody knows their rights and their responsibilities so people are protected.
Keenan.
Yeah, I mean, there's several things that you can do. One thing, if you're concerned about LGBTQ policy at the state level, sign up for action alerts at oneioaction.org. It's really hard to track everything at once as an individual if this isn't your job. Like, I remember the first year I lobbied on like 2 bills, and it was impossible because I only had like 2 or 3 hours a day to track this stuff, and things can change on an hourly basis. Like, everything changes extremely rapidly. So it's probably not possible to track all that legislation and where it's going and where the pressure points are yourself. And so you can utilize our list. You can go to Interfaith Alliance Action Fund and utilize their action alerts. They have wonderful action alerts as well. There's all sorts of other organizations that are doing that too. So whatever issue it is you care about, find an organization that is tracking that kind of stuff, go sign up for their action alerts so that you know when that important legislation is coming up for a vote, or when you need to talk to your legislator, or when that is going to happen. That's number one. Number two is, if there's an issue you care about and you see there's an event or a Zoom meeting or a phone bank or whatever it is that cause is doing, show up. Like go to the event. That helps a lot more than you might think. If 100 people show up to an event, that's a big deal. If 1,000 people show up to an event, that's a really big deal. And then you get like 10,000 people to your event, like that's going to be wall-to-wall local news coverage, right? So just being a body in a crowd is sometimes one of the most important things you can do.
Keenan, Stephanie, and Connie, thank you very much for being a part of this important conversation this morning. And thanks to everybody for joining us on the LGBTQ rights session. We've got 14 minutes now before our session 7 block, followed by our closing keynote, David Kennedy. Thanks, everyone. Have a great morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.